session rather than just strictly presentation. So now would be a great time to get out laptops and get connected to the Wi-Fi. I didn't get a chance to update the slides, but the password for the Alfresco Wi-Fi is "do great work," all in lowercase, no spaces, no underscores, no punctuation of any kind. So now is a good time, just as we present, as we warm up, to get connected. These two gentlemen in the front row, Gethin and Steve, my co-presenters, can you put your hands up and maybe stand up and wave? They're also going to be passing around some USB keys, and we would like you to copy the contents of those keys onto your laptop. It's a couple of zip files, 3 zip files from memory and a text file. We're going to be using that as the basis for the coding exercise. So if you could grab those two, that would be great. So this session is, as I mentioned, on the Alfresco API. This is something that the three of us have been working on for some time. We're going to do an introductory presentation, which will be me. I'll try to speak slowly and clearly. Obviously, I have an accent, so I'm hard to understand at times. We'll then get everybody to sign up for the developer portal. Those of you who've already signed up will basically be able to watch, but we're going to get you all signed up for the cloud APIs, and then we'll start developing against the Alfresco Cloud service. And Gethin is in fact going to lead that exercise. Steve, myself, and Nathan McMinn, who's not in the room yet but will be shortly, will be floating around helping if there's any question or if you run into any trouble. And that we expect to take about 60 minutes. We'll also spend a little bit of time at the end, time willing, on where to go to get further help, the future of the APIs, what's coming next beyond what you see today, and finally, questions and answers if we have any if you've got questions about the future of the API, things beyond the API, questions for Steve or Gethin about the implementation, etc. Will be a good opportunity to do that. So our objective for you for this session, the thing that we want you to come away with, is to leave the session with a functioning Alfresco Cloud app. My expectation and my experience in the last 2 DevCons has been attendees go away having learnt a lot. They then go back to their day job. 3 weeks, a month, 2 months later, they pick up the material again, and a lot of it has evaporated. So what my thinking is, and what Steve and Gethin and I have decided to do, is take a more interactive approach. We want you to leave the session with a functioning app so that in 3 weeks, a month, 2 months, you can say, there was some good API stuff I learned there. I don't really quite remember what it was about, but I have an application that I can go back to. I have code that works, that still works, and I'm going to be able to build on that, and that will start to reinforce what you learned, or bring back what you learned. So we're going to try to keep the presentation short, because coding exercises tend to be fairly time consuming, and we'll try to focus on that most of all. The other thing to mention is that this session is actually 2 sessions that we're using 2 sessions worth of time for a single session. We want all of you to spend as much time learning the APIs and coding with the APIs, and perhaps going beyond the examples that we're going to give you to code more interesting examples in the session. For that reason, we are running it continuously. But don't be scared, we're not going to do a break in the middle, but you should feel free to take a break at any time. If you need to go and get some coffee, you need a break of any kind, please just feel free to stand up and walk out. We're not going to be offended. And if indeed you've done everything in the first session, you want to go and catch a second session, that's fine too. We won't be at all upset. The USB drives are going around the room. Please pass them all the way back, and once you've copied them off, Gethin and Steve will be floating around, and you can just hand them back at the front or give it to one of the Alfresco folks at the end. So let's get started. First up, I wanted to really give an overview of what the Alfresco API is. A lot of you will probably be sitting there thinking, we already have a bunch of APIs. There's SOAP, there's CMIS, there's the Foundation Services API, there's the JavaScript API, FreeMarker, you name it, Alfresco has it. So what is this new Alfresco API? And really the primary driver has actually been the Alfresco Cloud. We want to offer extensibility options on top of our cloud offering. We want to allow customers and partners, community developers, etc., to build on our Alfresco Cloud service. And the first step in that is having an API that can be accessed from the cloud. So what we've done is we've taken CMIS, which we already had, of course. We've added it or augmented it with a series of REST APIs and provided that in cloud. And we actually launched that at Java 1 approximately a month ago. So that was at the end of September, early October. And that API has been public and is available in the cloud for some time. We had around a dozen launch partners, primarily US-based technology companies, assist us with that launch. So there are applications like Effersoft, they're actually one of the sponsors of the event. They've actually switched, or not switched, they've augmented their product to work with the Alfresco Cloud now. That's an interesting example. You know, you can now scan documents directly to the Alfresco Cloud. We want to give everybody that opportunity, so that is really what the APIs are about. Now, you might be wondering, what is it exactly that these two offer? Yeah, please just feel free to pass the keys around. CMIS, those of you who are not familiar with CMIS, it's really about basic file folder operations. So manipulating files, folder, metadata, version history. You can do revision control, so you can create working copies and check documents in and out. Really, sort of the core of content management is handled by that spec. It's by no means does everything or offers everything that Alfresco can do, but it's a really good core for that core file folder manipulation use case. In addition, we added these REST APIs, and the REST APIs augment CMIS with things that Alfresco can do that CMIS doesn't touch on. So it's things like looking at cloud networks, which are tenants in technical talk. Those of you who've used multi-tenancy in our cloud offering, we just use, we model our networks as tenants. Sites, so share sites, that again is not a CMIS concept. That's not something that's generic content management. So we've added in the ability to, at the moment, read site information, find out which sites a user is a member of, have they favorited a site, that kind of thing. People, looking at user objects, person objects in Alfresco, and being able to see who, you know, a user's profile information, manipulate that information in some cases, comments, tags, activities, and the list goes on. And I should mention, this V1 API, the first release we did at Java 1, was very much a common core. In fact, it was primarily targeted at our mobile application, the iOS and Android apps. But we're looking to add, we have a long list of APIs we want to add to it. So right now it's really just a first, you know, lowest common denominator, and we've built it in a way that it can be easily augmented and extended over time. The other thing that we introduced that is new and something that doesn't exist in the on-premise product and probably won't exist in the on-premise product for a little while is OAuth. And we've chosen OAuth2 to authenticate or to authorize applications to access the cloud. It's generally now, I think, become considered a best practice or a standard for authentication with cloud services. And certainly it does all of the things we need. It is secure. It allows us, most importantly, to identify not only who the user is, but also who the application is that is acting on behalf of that user. There's also the additional advantage that those third-party applications never have to handle or receive the user's password. And in a cloud, that's a very important characteristic to avoid Trojan horses. It also can be used, in our case, we're using it as the only authentication mechanism. So those of you who are familiar with our REST APIs, CMIS APIs that use, say, HTTP basic authentication, that's not available in cloud. HTTP basic auth is not secure in a cloud environment. It's not sufficient. We needed more control, and OAuth was the mechanism we chose to do that. So I wanted to go through quickly, because as we go through the coding exercise, one of the things people hear or think when they hear OAuth is, oh my goodness, it's this complicated sort of kludgy series of events. What you'll see in the coding exercise is that we've actually taken as much of the complexity out as we can, but it certainly helps to understand the OAuth flows in order to get an appreciation for what it is that the library that we'll be using does under the covers. So I'm going to quickly go through OAuth2. The first step with OAuth2 is an application developer registers on the portal. So you can see here we have our developer over here on the left. He signs into the portal. In our case, we have an Alfresco developer portal now, and signs up as a known quantity. That simply means that we can now identify when your applications are accessing our cloud service. We know who the application is, we know who the owner is, and if things go awry, we have someone we can contact and say, you know, hey, what's going on? The second step is that developer registers one or more applications. We have no limit, so you can register as many applications as you like. You can create one, play with it for a bit, and delete it. We really don't care. There's no restrictions on any of that. And this is where you start to get into actual keys and things that need to go into your application. So registering an application, the primary goal there is to get a series of OAuth keys. Your application then uses those keys through the OAuth flow, which we'll see next. So now we're looking at an authorization flow. And the authorization flow is the flow that your application uses when a user is driving your application and asking it to access the Alfresco cloud. And the first step up on the left is that you actually link to Alfresco's authentication page and you pass in your keys. So this allows us again to identify which application is this. Alfresco then displays an approval screen or an authorization screen which gives the user the option to disallow access. And again, this is a very important point. Your application cannot force itself on the user. The user has to manually approve the app, approve access to their cloud account through your application. So over on the right, we see that the user has actually authorized the app to access their cloud account. Again, important point here is nowhere did that user enter their password into your app. Your app never knows what that password is. It never sees it. So the user enters there or confirms their details and they approve your application. We then redirect back to your app and we pass through this thing called an authorization code. And an authorization code is basically, you can think of it as like a GUID. It's a little blob of opaque data. It has no meaning. And it's a one-time key. You can only use it once. In fact, the window for using it is about, I think it's 10 minutes if memory serves. So you have 10 minutes to convert that authorization code into an actual access token. And the access token, this is fully automated. So you can see the user doesn't see any of these flows. Technically, however, they are actually occurring behind the scenes. This is actually an HTTP post. So you're doing an HTTP post to the Alfresco service and you're upgrading or converting or exchanging your authorization code for two things, an access token and a refresh token. We'll see in a minute how those are used. But this is one of the confusing things about OAuth is everyone thinks, oh, I've got an authorization code, I can start calling APIs now. And that's not true. OAuth actually has this additional step where you exchange that short-lived code for a series of tokens. So what does an API call look like? An API call is actually remarkably simple. All you do is use that access token that you received in the previous flow in your API calls. And that access token is actually passed in the authorization HTTP header. So there's an HTTP header called authorization. It's a standard part of HTTP. And you set a bearer token to the value of that access token. And again, your app doesn't know what that access token means. It's a completely nonsensical string of characters and letters and numbers. But that token is important to us because it identifies the app and the user uniquely. And so you make your API call. You call a CMIS API, you call one of our REST APIs, that's a standard HTTP get, put, post, delete type operation, and we return your data. We just execute that API call. So it's very simple here, and this could happen many hundreds of times. So there's really not much to that diagram. Now the one thing about this is that these access tokens automatically expire. And that's again one of the security guarantees that OAuth provides, is that should this access token leak somehow, if your application puts it into a log file, let's say, and the log file gets stolen by a hacker, or it leaks it out via a UI element or a debugging output of some kind, that access token is only valid for a short period. And that means that that malicious use gets shut off after a short period of time. And in fact, what we've done is we've set up for now that our access tokens expire after 1 hour. So you can make an hour's worth of API calls in your app on behalf of that user. User never sees a login page except for the first time, of course. Your app never has to deal with authentication errors, 401, 403 type returns. You simply call APIs and your app will happily be executing on behalf of that user with the Alfresco cloud. So what happens after an hour? After an hour, you just make another API call. You may not know that the hour is up. And instead of executing your API, Alfresco is actually going to return a 401 error with a particular body, and it's a JSON body that tells you your access token has expired. So it is parsable. You can actually look at that error and know for sure that it's not due to some other type of security issue. But generally speaking, it's very clear that to your application that the access token has expired. And as I say, that will happen every hour, pretty much on the hour. Well, an hour after it was the user first approved your app. So what your app can do is use the refresh token. If you remember back to my first diagram where we exchanged the authorization code, we got back two things but for that authorization code. We got an access token, we got a refresh token. This is where the refresh token comes in. And the refresh token allows you to get a new access token. Once you have a new access token, you're back to the same old API call flow. You're just happily calling APIs again. Keep in mind, and this is an important thing, again, people get confused about OAuth. There are no users anywhere in this picture. This is fully automated within your app. Your app doesn't need to ask the user to reapprove your app again. It is somewhat complicated to get this flow right and to make sure you implemented the flow, but the flow itself doesn't bother the user. So we've had a few people say, well, I'm going to have to ask the user to log in again every hour. That's unacceptable. And the answer is no, you don't. This refresh token allows you to get new access tokens indefinitely. Your app can act on behalf of that user for a very long period of time. Now, there is one caveat to that, and these details are mentioned in the slides, which you'll all have access to, so you don't need to remember it. But if a user does not use your application for 1 week, the refresh token expires as well. And at that point, you will need to go all the way back to the start and ask the user to manually re-authenticate. So that only happens, though, for a period, an inactivity period of 7 days. Provided the user uses your app at least once every 7 days, they will never see a login again. They'll get exactly one login page, and that will last indefinitely. A question at the back.
Does OAuth provide a mechanism to request a refresh token which never expires? I'm just thinking about apps that maybe don't involve a user.
Well, it doesn't matter whether, so the question was just for the recording. The question was, does OAuth provide a way to get a refresh token that never expires? The short answer to your question is we can actually pick whatever expiry we want. So that's something we've chosen to do as 7 days. We talked about making it a month. 7 days actually makes it easier to test because you have to get this flow implemented. And to be honest, to test this, you have to wait 7 days. That's kind of a pain if you're trying to run a unit test or something. So we've talked internally about what we might do. We may make the access token 24 hours instead of 1 hour, and we might make the refresh token 1 month instead of 7 days. We're still playing with it. This is early days, so chances are it will change. To answer your question though, having infinite refresh tokens is actually a security risk. Because again, if the refresh token gets exposed, if your app makes a mistake and shows that even once, another app completely unrelated to yours can now not only masquerade as your app, but access that user's account on your app's behalf. And to us, in our management console, what we see is your app is suddenly deleting the user's content. We're going to be calling you to find out what's going on. So there is actually a good reason for this. And keep in mind, there doesn't need, once you've got those tokens, you don't need to have any user interaction again. So you only need to show a user interface once to get the user to approve your app. And from that point onward, provided your app uses the token at least once a week, you'll never need to ask the user again. So for truly batch applications where you never ever show the user anything, OAuth is not great, but there's no secure alternative that we've figured out yet. Yeah. But once you've got the token, just use it once a week and you'll never need to ask the user again. Okay, so let's switch over to the developer portal. So this is where all of you should crank open your laptops and make sure you've got an internet connection. We'll run through. Let me bring up my browser. So this is the developer portal, and I'm sorry that that's not bigger, and I don't know if that light's blocking the view of the screen, but the URL that we're all going to go to, so please open up your laptops. We're going to start the sort of interactive part of this session now. Is developer.alfresco.com. It's also linked from the develop link on the homepage. So if you go to alfresco.com and click develop, you'll also get sent to this page. And what we're all going to do is register as a developer. So if you click that link, you'll get a little pop-up. And you can fill in a few details. And if anyone has a laptop in their room or whatever, now would be a great time to run out. Please don't feel shy about getting up and running for a break. We're trying to make this an interactive session. So if any of you want to get a laptop, now is a great time before we get too far into this. Fill in your email address, which will become your login. I hope I remember to delete my account earlier today. Accept the terms and conditions. These are worth reading, by the way. I don't want you to just blindly click through. I know, it's one of those things that you face endlessly on the internet is when signing up for these services. To summarize very briefly, our terms and conditions really state three main things. Alfresco is ours. Your app is yours. The content that your users, that our users put into cloud, however they do that, through your app, through our app, through someone else's app, is theirs. And that's really a core philosophy. Our users' content is theirs. In accepting these terms and conditions, you're basically accepting that you don't own our users' content, and neither do we. And similarly, we don't own your app. Your app is yours. It's your intellectual property. You can do with it as you wish. So worth reading, worth getting a lawyer, blah, blah, blah. I have to give you that disclaimer. But just to be clear, that is the purpose of our terms and conditions, is to clearly state who owns those three pieces. And then rather than doing next step, we're actually going to register now. So if you register, you'll notice that your account has been created and you'll need to wait for an email. So now let's go over and have a look at my inbox. And refresh and refresh. Now, one thing we've noticed, that you saw that was pretty quick. We have noticed some email domains, some of our partners and customers receive these emails hours later. So we're not sure, email is obviously a best effort type thing. Those of you who've signed up may need to wait a little bit to get this email. And it is important because when we have a look, you have to actually approve or confirm your registration. And that's to stop spoofing. If I go and enter your email addresses, I'm sure you don't want to be signed up for some service you had no idea about. So clicking this link is an important step because this is what will actually finalize your account. So I'm now going to log in. And I now have a developer account. And I'm just a standard developer. We only have one tier, so everyone pretty much who signs up will end up at the same level. Anybody have any trouble with any of that? All went smoothly? Those of you who have laptops? Should be pretty straightforward. Like I say, the one hassle is the email turnaround can be quite slow. It can take a little while for that email to appear. So I'll keep on going quickly or through the rest of this. And as you get your emails, you'll be able to just approve. Now, when you log in, you do go to this dashboard. It's very minimal right now. You can add a few other widgets in here, and there's some other bits and pieces, but most of them, to be honest, aren't super useful yet. We're still in the process of building out this web property, so things are going to be in a bit of a state of flux. We will try to post messages. If we have, for example, changes to APIs, my hope, and well, my plan is to actually start to post them here so that when you log in, you can see, hey, we've got a new API that supports workflow or whatever it is. The primary use here is actually this Applications tab, however, and this is where you register your applications. So I'm going to click in here and create a new application. And I'm going to call it Peter's Test Application. These other fields are mostly informational. It's actually just for us to get a sense of what sorts of applications you're all developing. Feel free to, please answer it honestly because it'll help us to tailor what we do based on demand. At the moment, it's just technology platform basically. But in the future, we may add things like, hey, I'm doing a scanning app, or I'm doing transactional content management, or case management, or whatever it is. So we're hoping to make this a multi-pick rather than a single select. But for now, it really just captures a technology platform. Description's optional. And then you get to pick which API. Right now, we really only have one API, and our intention is to only offer one API, which will be the API. So this lets you access the Alfresco public API. Again, you accept the terms and conditions and move to the next step. Now, finally, we get to the point where we are actually here defining some specifics of our application. If you remember back to the OAuth flow, those flow diagrams I showed, there was a step where Alfresco redirects back to your app in order to complete the transaction, basically to give you the authorization code. To do that, we need to know what the callback URL of your application is. It doesn't have to be on the internet, it doesn't have to be public, as long as the user's browser, the user who's accessing your app, can access it. So it can be an internal, behind the firewall app. The URL though will be, we will send a 302 redirect to that URL. The browser has to be able to dereference that URL and access that server. So it is important. The other thing I'll say is this needs to be correct. If it's not correct, you'll get a redirect to some URL that doesn't exist in your app. You'll never get your access tokens, you'll never get your authorization code, you'll never be able to exchange them. So this is very important. The demo that Gethin's going to be running through here in a minute actually has a very specific callback URL. And what I'm actually going to do is switch over to that OAuth Those of you who've copied off the thumb drive will have this file, and you'll see in here that there is a redirect URL already defined. And it's really important that you get that exactly right. So I'm going to copy and paste. I'm sorry. And if it's not right, we will find out during the coding exercise. OAuth has a notion of scopes, which can be thought of as different authorization levels. So we have talked about maybe opening this up and making it read, write, delete, maybe making it read site, write site, delete site, read network, create network. Well, we're probably not going to offer that. Read people details, etc. We haven't got to that point yet. At the moment, we have a single scope that's global. Once you have that scope, you can pretty much call any of the APIs, read, write, or other. And then we have a type of public. The plan is actually to make that read-only like this guy. We just haven't quite got there yet, again. So when I save this, I now have an application. Again, I'll receive an email, so I'll get a notification that the application was created. Did I tap that? I think my wireless just may have died. Anyone else having trouble with wireless? I think we killed it. It's a little bit sad. I'm going to do a magic trick now and switch to the wire. I wish you guys could do the same thing, but... And we had this concern, so we'll see if it comes back. I'm going to cancel out of that and add it again. And what should happen, if the wireless was cooperating, is that you would see now your app. And you, as I mentioned, you're free to add as many other apps as you like. You can also delete them if you want, disable an app temporarily, etc. This is all fully under your control. We actually do have admin privileges, so we can do the same thing, but at this stage we have no policy around doing that, short of users calling up and saying, there's an app that deleted all my content, and if we get enough users saying that, we might shut your app off. But at this stage, that's sort of a hypothetical situation, I think. Now, you'll also notice here that we have this thing called an API key. So this is the first of the important parts of OAuth that need to go into the source code of your application. So this is the API key, and there's actually two parts, and this UI is a little bit misleading. You actually need to go in and edit this app, click on the Auth tab, and it shows you the API key again. You can also fix the URL if there was a typo in it or something. But there's a second thing here called a secret. These are both part of the OAuth standard, so there's the idea of an API key that uniquely identifies your app, and a secret that also is unique to your application. Both of these are part of the OAuth flow. Both of them need to go into your source code. So it's important to know where to find them, and that's why I'm showing this here. Now, those of you who have functioning internet, if anybody, when you get to this point, I would suggest leaving this page open, because when we get into the coding exercise, one of the things Gethin's going to ask you to do is to copy and paste the key and the secret into your app. Now, what we've also done, for those of you who haven't received the email, don't have a login yet, can't register an app, Gethin's actually created a key for you, and that's also in that text file. So even in the worst case where you haven't managed to register on the portal yet, we've given you a key and a secret. Just be aware that probably in about a month's time, we're going to shut that off. because it's sort of an abuse of OAuth. You'll all be acting as Gethin's app, and Gethin may get into trouble depending on what you do with the cloud. So once you get to this point, we'll leave that page up. Yeah, question or comment.
On the callback URL, I'm not totally clear on how that works. Does that need to provide something at the end of that URL? Does that page have to have information? How does it work?
So the question, again for the recording, is this callback URL, does it have additional information? How does it work? Are there additional components to the URL that get passed when the redirect is issued? The answer is yes, there is additional information. There's the authorization code specifically. And that is passed in a query string parameter, and we'll see that in the code, I think, in a minute, what that value of that query string parameter is. And the reason is this URL, there's no direct call from Alfresco to this URL. Alfresco Cloud may not even have access to this URL if it's inside the data center behind a firewall, for example. What we do is we issue a browser-side redirect. So we send back a 302 status code redirect with this URL plus question mark authorization code equals gobbledygook. It's a big long 40-character, 20-something character string. The browser responds to that 302 by following it. It follows the 302 and redirects to your app. Your app would typically then parse the URL. This callback thing could be a servlet, could be a JSP page. I mean, we really don't care what technology it is. But what that code needs to do is pull out the authorization code and then start to perform the rest of the OAuth flow. In particular, exchanging the authorization code for an access token and a refresh token, which is a post. So this is one of the sort of weird things about OAuth is there's bits that occur client side where it's handoffs from Alfresco to your browser. Browser then is requesting a URL in your app. And then there are pieces that are direct calls between your app and Alfresco. This callback URL is one of the key places that the flow occurs via the browser. When you exchange the authorization code for the access token, you're actually making a direct post request against the server. So that becomes your app talking directly to the Alfresco Cloud, browser's not involved. And what you'll see in most apps, if you've used Twitter or Facebook, Google, they all use OAuth. Typically they pop up the initial authorization page in a pop-up, in a browser pop-up. They'll say click here to authorize your Google, access to your Google account. They do it in a little mini pop-up. You log in if you're not logged in and you hit approve or deny, allow or deny, those sorts of things, or yes and no thanks is one I think I've seen from maybe from Dropbox. When you hit yes, the pop-up redirects back to the app that is requesting access, and then the pop-up closes. So generally, this callback will parse the authorization code, convert it to an access token, refresh token pair, and then emit some JavaScript, like a mini HTML page that just closes the pop-up. It never renders anything. And at that point, your app is actually ready to go. The backing page, the page that did the pop-up, has the access token, has the refresh token. You'd typically refresh, and that code just has an if at the top that says, oh, we've got an access token now. I'm going to start calling API calls all over the place. Yeah, yeah, it's kind of mind-bending the way they've done it, but it actually is pretty cool as well. I've sort of misused, not even misused, it's an interesting use of what HTTP can do and what browsers can do to avoid ever having your app receiving a password. Yeah, you're welcome. I think with no further ado, I'll ask Gethin to take the stage. Oh, sorry, question at the back. So the question, again for the recording, the question was, is it possible to differentiate between a development environment, testing environment, and say a production environment? The answer is not directly. What I would suggest is that you have a callback URL that might include, and let me switch back to that, a callback URL that is a single URL for all of your environments, and then perhaps what you add in here is an additional parameter or some sort of state to try to figure that out. I think it's going to be a little bit complicated. You may need to use browser-side state because that's all you've got here is effectively the browser hitting this URL. One thing you can also do is, of course, come in at any time and switch the callback URL around as your app goes through its testing processes. And you can create as many apps as you like, so you might create V1 pointing to a development callback, Once you release it, you switch the callback URL to your production URL. V2 or V11 then comes along, just create a new app. So we've deliberately been very loose. We're letting you create as many apps as you like. A, because they're lightweight, it's just some keys, who cares? And B, yes, there are some use cases where it may help to be able to create multiple apps, which are really just versions of the same app. Yeah. Another question back left. Try a different USB stick. They should all just be downloadable from the USB sticks. Yeah, sorry. Thanks, Steve. We've actually put them up with the DevCon materials, but I don't know what the permissions are on that site yet. I know there was some, there was, one of the things is we're not just doing a PowerPoint here, we're doing some zip files, and I don't know if the Drupal site yet allows you to download any kind of files, so. We'll fix that after the conference, but for now, these guys are, sorry, the best way to get it. Yeah. If there are no further questions, I will hand over to Gethin.
Hello? Oh, echoes a bit. See how we get on. Just need to swap this over. If anybody's not got the code, there's some USB sticks here while I'm just setting up. I'll just run around. You can download them, or you can use the USB sticks that have been given out. Okay, so on the USB drive, there's a couple of zip files. We're really nervous about the network here, so we've got one which says with dependencies on it. So if you'd like to unzip that file, I'm going to use that one.
I would say please don't download that over the Wi-Fi because it's 50 megabytes, so it's not that big, but it's big for the wireless. So even though we have the download working in this room, let's try to use these ones. So the wireless.
The other one's there as a Maven version. For those using Maven, I'm not sure what the download's going to be like for that. So feel free to use the one with dependencies. That's what I'm using. So if you unzip that file, that zip file, you should see a directory that looks something like that. Can you see that at the back? I'm not sure as much I can do either, but...
Can you make the font a little bigger?
The dark blue's not good.
Is that blue one?
You see my point.
Is that any better? You don't need to know this. Don't worry, don't worry. Okay, so there's a README there as well, which probably is going to go through most of the things we need to do. First, this is, well, basically this is samples, just assuming you've got Java. So if everybody's got Java, we're okay. You don't need to install anything else. This is using a thing called the Gradle wrapper, which just uses Java. So in order for it to work, it just needs to know where your distribution is. So if you just go to the Gradle wrapper properties file, Maven users won't need to do this, and enter your distribution here, which is the absolute path to the file. So I'll do mine here. So mine is that huge users. It's not a short link. Oops. So here. So my URL is the root of that directory plus distribution / Gradle bin. And that should mean that we don't have to use the internet connection to do this, hopefully. So then if you type Gradle W.
Can you just move the mouse a little bit?
Sure. That worked really quickly. That actually, I've already got mine unzipped, but you should see some dots, and that should unzip the distribution locally so that you can type Gradle W commands. How are you getting on? It's kind of strange doing coding demo and then not really getting feedback to know how people are getting on. But you should see the word build successful. If anybody needs help, just raise their hand. There'll be people walking around.
Do you define the Gradle properties file in the root of the project?
It's in, if I show you here. So it's in Gradle wrapper, Gradle wrapper properties.
Okay, thank you.
This is just so we've got a local environment. So hopefully all those people today who are doing this can go away with a working application. Okay. So now we've got the environment set up, we need to use the application keys that Peter was talking about. So I've probably timed out. Yeah. Yeah. I'm going to create an application. So the application name is quite important. This is what the user is going to see when they authorize. So make sure it's meaningful so they know this is your application. Just put anything here. Yeah, the callback URL. So I'm leaving on that page. So I'm going to flip to using Eclipse for my work. So Eclipse users, you can type Gradle W Eclipse. Maven users can do MVN Eclipse, and that will generate you some Eclipse config files so that you can import your project into Eclipse. It's not mandatory to use Eclipse. So I've generated some property files. So hopefully I should be able to import the file. With some errors. I think that's okay. Okay, so this is the application code. So we need to tell the application to use that client key, secret, and callback URLs. So in source main resources config.properties, this is where you enter your client key, secret, and redirect URI. So if I flick back here, that's going to be my callback URL. This has to, as Peter said, this has to match exactly. It's actually checked in the authorization process. So we need to make sure it matches exactly. I'm going to save that. DevCon, this is what. So here's my API key. Which goes there. Here's my secret. Which goes there. Okay. Okay. So this application is a Java application that uses Spring Social Alfresco. It also includes CMIS, the open CMIS extensions from Alfresco. Spring Social Alfresco was written by Jared, who's sitting in the back in the corner. Steve as well. So if there's any questions on it, he's the man. Or if I've not used it very well, he'll tell me maybe as well. So it's got an embedded Jetty instance, a little server-side application. So to run that, you do Gradle W Jetty run. Maven users can do Jetty :run. Touch wood, this should start up. As I said, the only requirement is the recent Java version. So it should say running at localhost 8090 Alpha API. And you should see that screen. Can anybody raise their hand if they see that screen? And if you see the Alfresco logo, that means you're using the internet. And I'm going to go through the OAuth dance with you, which is the bit that sounds quite complicated in some of the slides. Spring Alfresco does a lot of the hard work for you. It's a client library for that. So it should make things a bit simpler.
I was going to ask, how many people have actually managed to register on the call line over the amount of problems? So that's step one. And added an application? Yep. got the zip file on zip, found the Gradle W, the Gradle wrappers. Some shaking.
I do it another way.
Okay, cool. Yeah, question.
I'm just going to wait a minute or two for these people. Okay, I'm going to click on the first link. And if you see this, you're doing very well. Let me just maximize that.
It's very confusing. This is why.
If you see invalid client ID or something like that, let us know. It's usually that your tokens are wrong. But this is the authorization page that users will see. Can anybody see this page on their local machines? I hope so. So some things to notice on this page, it's got the name of your application here. And this is the prompt that the user will see when they're authorizing your application against the Alfresco API. So I'm going to enter my credentials from a cloud account. So you need to be registered on the cloud to use this as a user. And when I do this, it's going to redirect to that callback URL that we've specified already. So before I do this, I'm going to show you some of the code. So essentially, I've tried to make the most basic app I could, server-side Java basic app I could, which is quite a challenge because I'd forgotten how to do servlets and JSPs. But hopefully it works all right. So I've got a basic servlet here called dance start, which has got an init method. So how can we see this? Sure. So basically, I mean, all applications have to do some sort of Bootstrap functionality. So this is kind of the Bootstrap. I've chosen to do it in a servlet init method. I'm not sure if that's the best place to do it. It's up to you to decide your applications. But this would be on startup of your application when you wanted to do something. So this basically takes my config file. You can do how you want. It takes your config file and creates an Alfresco connection factory. And then it works out what the authorization URL is and the redirect URL. These are actually not used, but they're in the config file as well. So when you authorize, you can see there in the commented out code, /authorize, that's the URL that your application goes through. And that's where you see that dialog I just showed you. And when you use the refresh token, that's the /token. So going back to the Bootstrap, I basically just set these up, and I'm setting them in the servlet context for you to use later on. And this is the start page. So all it's doing is sending a redirect to that authorization URL. And if I show you that page, it's in here. You can see it's gone to /authorize at the top, hopefully. And it's passed in, it's hard to see this, but it's passed in your client ID. You might be able to see client ID and the response URL. So all that complicated things that Peter was explaining, this is doing it all for you. So hopefully it'll make your life easier. And when I click allow, it's going to go to the callback page. Sorry about the echo. When I click allow, it's going to go back to the callback page. So I'll click allow and show you the callback page. So there's a question earlier on about what happens when you get the callback. Essentially, the callback page just has two added parameters to it. One is the authorization code, first line. And the second is the scope, which is not really used, as we discussed earlier. So when your application is called back, it gets the authorization code here, and then you can use that in your app. And Spring Social does a lot of this for you. So you'll see here I've got an exchange for access method. This is the key bit of code that takes that authorization code and turns it into an access token. You get this access grant object, and then from then on you've got an access code. I'm logging this out to the log file, your access code. So yeah, so there's a log file in here somewhere. Just have to refresh it. And there's my access token. So this is the key thing. This lasts for an hour. It's what you want to use. Copy. I'm just going to hack this and use REST client just to prove a point. So if I put my token in there and call just a standard URL, hopefully I'll get a response back. Yeah. So that means I'm calling the Alfresco API using that access token. All it is as we said, it's a header set in here, OAuth2 bearer with the access token, and that's just returning a little bit of information from the API. Okay, so in my dance callback, I'm basically getting that access grant and then just setting it in a session. It's not really recommended. You'd probably want to store that in your data store to look up. But for this example, I'm just having a running app, just showing you how to use it. There's an access token, an access grant object, which you can store locally, which is give you all the information you've got. It's got access token, scope, refresh token, expire time. And then in this, yeah.
Where are your permissions stored? So in the previous example, you had a list of permissions with granted
Yeah.
application.
That's the scope in OAuth, and at the moment it's just set to public API, so it's defaulted. OAuth have other scopes, and Peter was suggesting is we might do that in the future, but we've just said public API is the scope for now, which is all that set.
And that gives you just kind of, you can write on behalf of this user sort of.
Yeah, those public API, anything in the public API you can use.
You can do anything that the API support.
Okay,
Scope.
as this user scope. Okay.
Okay, so I'm actually redirecting to another class here just to show you, called Use Connection Servlet, which is starting to use Spring Social really. So with the access grant, I can create a connection, and then I've got a real Alfresco connection to call the API. Here's some calls I've done to get the home network, to get the current user. Let me show you this class. How can I show you this class?
So just out of interest, who is still at an earlier step? Don't be shy. Because we just don't want to rush too far ahead if we're still getting OAuth keys set up, if you're having trouble with the Gradle scripts. If the Wi-Fi is blowing up. The Wi-Fi, I wish I could do something about. Does anyone still have trouble with the Gradle scripts or some of the things that don't need an internet connection?
Yeah. Sorry.
Gradle W, /Gradle W, Gethin run.
Ah. Yeah, this is the Alfresco class here. So.
Gradle's a different build tool. It's similar to making the Maven version of this as well, and all the others here. But we're just not using it because we didn't want Maven to try to download the internet over Wi-Fi. We knew that would be a problem.
So, as we discussed, there's the CMIS API and there's the Alfresco API. This is the documentation for the Alfresco API. It's very well documented. You don't need to use the wrapper that we're talking about. You can just call it yourself. So there's various things you can do. So this is available off the developer portal. You can just download it. And that goes through the OAuth flow using your API keys, secret as well. And then it talks as well about what you can do, folders, creating folders, policies, etc.
And that will run a mini web server, so it's running a mini server with your app.
And this is what the Alfresco JSON extension API. You can get sites, containers, members, people, favorite sites. And that's what I did in this REST example here. So I've called sites, and I happen to have a site called public API trial site. And I just did a get on that URL to return that entry. Okay. So I'm going to get to
This is a cloud.
I'm going to get to a little stage shortly where you can start writing your own code, and then I'll have a little pause to see how you're getting on.
No, because this is an end user login, not a developer login. Yeah.
So this is my use connection servlet. Basically uses a connection and then just calls a JSP. So I have a JSP somewhere.
If you see this, it means you're going into one connection. That's coming from .alfresco. So that's just showing you have access.
So this is really just getting the information out of the session, calling person.last name, person email. So if you're seeing this, you're talking to the public Alfresco Cloud API. And that's what I've got there. So this information comes from Alfresco as my network, CMIS root folder. And then I've got a do something servlet there for you to do something.
Can you maybe show the code that just shows the network? I know we've got a few folks who are at the point of having the app running, but they didn't see the filling in the blank steps.
Filling in which bits?
Showing the network ID and making the first API calls. We just had some folks who are now connected, but that was quite right for that.
Well, what I'll do, I'll just show you this class, and then I'll stop and I'll go through with guys. So this do something servlet basically now has these variables that you can use. So Alfresco is the this CMIS session here gives you all the CMIS calls. This is a wrapper on the CMIS calls you can see. So you can do get object by path, get object by ID. I'm going to run through more of a demo in a minute, but there's this one, do something servlet, and also to speed things up, I've got a Groovy version of this, which is in source main web app rapid do something Groovy, which is the same sort of thing. And so if I click on that, yeah, that's me using the API. So I'm just going to pause and see how you're all getting on, and then we're going to do some more uploading a photo using the Cloud API. How are we getting on? Is anybody still with me?
Who has the Jetty app running, the Jetty server running just the base source code? It keeps going.
Internet connection? How are you getting on? That's good. So that's your log on to the cloud? Yeah? Is that right? Yeah, that's brilliant. Brilliant.
Gets to make an API call. Yeah.
Okay.
Could maybe I ask everyone who has a mobile device, maybe to disconnect from the Wi-Fi, because we have a lot of people using laptops trying to actually follow along. So if you're on a mobile device doing something else, maybe either shut it off from the Alfresco Wi-Fi or step outside so you're on a different router. That makes it help with some bandwidth sharing.
Actually, there was also
There's HONOS and which has a conference code, so the conference code, yeah. It does, yeah. Yeah. We're just Wi-Fi is easy to learn.
We'll form a queue for the wire.
Yes. I think that's what we should do. This guy has a wire.
Can do.
If you're not doing the exercise, please disconnect from the Wi-Fi. You're taking the Wi-Fi away from people.
Huh?
Good.
Cool.
Excellent.
I'm paying for the hotel Wi-Fi.
Are you crazy?
Are you causing interference with the other business?
Is it all right? The access point? Yeah. Doing all right. Cool. We'll see.
The very first change you made to show the network name. Just bring up the server. They're connected, but the Wi-Fi is not letting them, so they haven't seen the code yet.
Which bit? The first?
The very first change you made to show the network name or whatever.
I showed the properties.
No, I mean the first actual API call where they changed.
Okay, so I'm going to go on with some more examples. This is the, just to recap, this is the use connection servlet, which shows us actually using the API. So these calls here, get home network will actually call the public API and get the home network. Get current user will call it the same. So these, if you see this object, this is really network and person. They're coming from the public API. So now I'm going to go, live demos tend to not work. I'm going to go into something scarier for me to start writing some code as we go along. So I'm going to take this code. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to create a folder and upload a photo to it using the API. Maybe, depending on how much long we've got left, maybe tag it, comment on it. Probably won't get to that, but I can show you the methods. So, okay, so I'm just renaming one of the files. There we go. So I'm ready to write some code now. So I've got here the Alfresco network and person objects. And I'm going to create a folder. So somewhere here, I've got Alfresco. It's probably timed out. Yeah. So I've just got a site. This is called public API trial site. I'd suggest you just create your own site for this demo. And I've got the document library. So what I'm going to try and do is get a folder. And I'm going to use CMIS for this. So CMIS session dot get object by path, I think I'll do. And so I need to pass in the path to get the object ID. And if I remember, it starts with /site. And mine's public API trial site. Actually, I'm going to take the rest of this as well. So I'm pointing to this DevCon folder here. So hopefully, let's just cut and paste. Yeah, so it's a bit hard to tell, but DevCon is the name of the folder. So I've just got that using the public API. If I want to get the ID, there's the ID. Okay, so that's calling, just to recap, it's calling Alfresco Cloud, and it's going to the site's public ID, that's the site name, document library, and the folder. So I've got a folder there, got a reference to a folder, so I can create a folder there. So let's create a folder. Create folder. You need to create a folder with a map of properties. So I need to specify the type of this folder that I'm creating and the name of it. And I'm cheating because I've got some notes that you've also got here. Okay. So they're actually constants you can use. You don't have to use the literal strings like that. The constants are available in one of the classes in CMIS. But all I'm going to do is create a CMIS object of type folder with the name of my photos. And yeah, I am using Groovy, but this is just Java and the covers, so you can use Java if you want. You don't need to use Groovy. It's just for speed of demos. I don't need to recompile anything. And I presume that's going to return a folder object. Wow. I was surprised it worked first time. Yeah, so I've just created a folder. So let's just see if it works. If I refresh this. Yeah, there we go. So I've created a folder, the cloud, using the API. If I want to create another one, run that again. First two. And there's various things you can do with this API. So I could do, so for that folder, get all its children. And then in Groovy you can do each. So this is probably not going to work the first time because I haven't changed the name yet. So the object with the name already exists because the folder I just created already exists. So if I change that to 3, yeah, so you can see I created the folder 3 and then it's looping through the children of that to see what folder's created. So now I can go on. I won't go on for long. There we go. How How are we doing? Is anybody still following along? Are you going to be doing your slides later?
Yeah, we've got about 20 minutes.
Okay. So I haven't got long. How long is the slide? 10 minutes?
5.
Okay. So in my notes here, I've done the same sort of thing. Let's see if I can upload a photo. I'm going to take a shortcut. I'm going to take this content here. So I'll wipe that off. So I'm going to reference exactly that folder I created. I'm going to lose this. Okay. So again, I'm just going to get a reference to the folder. This time I'm going to create a new file, and this time it's a document, and the name is DevCon photo, and it's a JPEG. I'm pretty sure this location is wrong at the moment, though. Bear with me. Where did I put it? Well, let me see if it works. DevCon, pizza 1. Okay. So again, using the API, I'm going to read in that file, set the content stream, set the type of it to JPEG, and then I'm going to create the document using those properties, hopefully. See what happens. Oh, there's more like it. Looks like imports to me. I'm not sure how big the document is, so it might take a little while over the network to try and see if it works. That's cool. That's actually worked, and that's showing me the ID of that photo. I believe, maybe not. Let's have a look. Wow, it worked. Just wait for the thumbnail to render. There we go. It's a photo Steve took.
You an Instagram fan?
I think I'm going to leave it there and let you talk through the rest of the slides and then answer any questions at the end. Sure. Microphone on. Just bear with me. You can answer that.
Oh, okay, sorry. So just to repeat the question, as I think I heard it as I was walking out the back, the question was around if you wanted to create the folder and the file, the photo transactionally in a single atomic operation, is that possible? The answer is no. CMIS doesn't have support for out-of-band transactions or client-defined transactions, so there's no way using CMIS. And I should point out, all of the calls that Gethin demonstrated there were all pure CMIS. So he was using the open CMIS, the Apache chemistry libraries, with one exception early on, which was showing the home network. That's actually an Alfresco specific API call. But all of the things in that demo.groovy were pure CMIS. You could have written that in any language that supports CMIS and we would have done it the same way. To your specific question, CMIS doesn't have support for client-controlled transactions, and that's actually a good thing because in the cloud, you never want a client to control a transaction. Partly because you can't guarantee that the client won't go away, and leaving dangling transactions, of course, is a pretty serious cause of problems. And it's a cause of problems with our on-premise product as well. That's why the Alfresco out-of-process APIs for the on-premise product don't support transaction control by the client either. You have to do something in a web script. You have to write Java code that runs inside the server. So I've done a lot of stuff with 2PC back in the 90s, so I know a lot about XA and all those sorts of horrible things. It is no loss at all that we don't allow that. It's actually a good architectural practice. And what you'll notice with all of the web APIs that are out there, Dropbox, Box, Google Docs, some of the other ones that we've integrated with, none of them allow the client to define their own atomic units of work. Now, one of the things for the future that we may get to, and if my laptop wakes up, I can talk a little bit about this, is potentially offering the ability to submit units of work. The idea being something like creating a folder and creating a file in the folder, that does make sense in a lot of cases as a transactional operation. But rather than having the client make a begin tran call, create folder, create file, commit tran, or complete tran, whatever, instead of doing it that way with the client controlling it, you would instead send up as a unit of work a create call, create folder, create file call. That's a long way off though. It needs a lot of careful thought because as soon as you do that, people want to start scripting as well. They want to create a folder, enumerate the children of some other folder, calculate pi to a bazillion digits, and then commit. And as soon as we do that, our cloud service is going to be executing that logic, and the risk for particularly distributed denial of service type attacks just through submitting complex code goes way up. So we're very aware of that as a requirement. Certainly, I'm thinking a lot about it from a product management perspective, but it's a thorny problem. What you'll notice today is there's none of these cloud APIs support transactions, at least none of the ones I'm aware of.
What you're speaking something similar to the SOAP API, the consent.
Exactly, yeah. It's just like the old CML stuff. Those of you who know the old V1 pre-CMIS SOAP API that we called it CML, where you could submit effectively a set of manipulation instructions. That's what we're thinking of, but it's not there yet. It turns out actually CMIS, I believe the committee has actually discussed that as well. So we would rather see it handled by CMIS and have them standardize it, and then we'll implement the spec. Obviously that's good for everybody. It's good for all of you guys who want your apps to work against Alfresco or Documentum, SharePoint, whoever. And it was good, it was a nice thing for me to hear that they have actually discussed that, but it was, very high level, very preliminary, very non-committed type discussion.
We prefer performance as well because we're not the same to make 10 calls.
Yes and no. There's actually other ways around that. So we're looking at, so the question then was for performance, and keep in mind, performance is two different things. It's latency, which is what you're talking about, and throughput, which is something completely unrelated. On the internet, latency is absolutely an issue because you've got round trip times typically in the tens to hundreds of milliseconds just for one API call. It's pure overhead. HTTP pipelining is actually one way around that. So you allow the client to send multiple HTTP requests without waiting for the first response to come back, and that actually mitigates latency without needing, custom protocols, custom APIs. That's just part of HTTP 1.1. So we actually I think we have a JIRA on pipelining support. Maybe I didn't create that one yet. I can't remember. You guys, does that ring any bells? So I would love, Tomcat is an HTTP 1.1 compliant server. Our cloud is using Tomcat. So theoretically, we should already have HTTP pipelining. It's just something we need to test and make sure it actually, works and works well. The other thing I'm interested in actually is Speedy Push. So potentially considering opening up the APIs to Speedy as well. And the Speedy protocol, which is a Google protocol, sort of successor to HTTP, one of the provisions it has is around the ability for a client to submit one GET request and actually have the server push back multiple responses. So you can actually, it's mostly for HTML web pages is the intention, where you get the HTML page and the server sends back all the CSS, all the JavaScript, all the images, ... I'm trying to figure out if there's any API correlation to that. Like maybe when you get a folder, we push down the child objects as well, because 80% of the time you're going to want to enumerate the children in the very next request. The problem with that is it breaks CMIS. CMIS is not expecting that, and open CMIS and PHP, the PHP libraries and so forth would need a bit of work. But these are all, I should be really clear, all of this stuff that I'm saying is very highly speculative. None of it's committed yet, none of it's really been discussed or validated, but these are things that I'm thinking about and looking at as opportunities to help with transactionality, to help with performance and latency mitigation. But certainly I don't think we will ever add client-controlled transactions. I think that's not a good solution, particularly in cloud, even for our on-premise product. It's not where we want to go. Because as soon as you do that, you've got to get into 2PC. And XA is not a good, it's just not good. So, any other questions before we move on? You can see my screen, I guess. So we went through the coding exercise. By the way, I meant to ask before we started that, how many of you are familiar with CMIS? How many of you are already using it? Okay, good. So the thing I wanted you all to come away with from what Gethin just showed is that should have mostly been familiar to you. Maybe you're not familiar with the Java client bindings he was using, the Open CMIS library. But that was all pure CMIS with the exception of the OAuth handshake at the front. So those of you who know CMIS, you already know you have a significant amount of knowledge already about the Alfresco Cloud API. It's just that OAuth handshake at the start that is a little bit different. The other thing we're doing, for those of you who are using any of the Apache chemistry libraries, the Python library, the Java library, and the PHP library, I know, we've already added in support to Java and Python, I think, to put in support for that header, the access token header. So once you've got your access token, you can pass that through in using those libraries natively now. I think for the Java one, I know it's as of version 0.8. I'm not as sure about the PHP and .NET client libraries, but presumably they'll add that soon as well. The upshot is once you've got the OAuth access token,